Chapter 7. What is Love? Sammy Lane rode very slowly on her way home from the Matthews place that morning after the stranger had arrived. She started out at her usual reckless gant, but that was because she knew the young Matt was watching her. Once in the timber, the brown pony was pulled to a walk, and by the time they came out into the open again, the little horse, unrebuked by his mistress, was snatching mouthfuls of grass as he strolled along the trail. Sammy was thinking very seriously. Aunt Molly's parting question had stirred the girl deeply. Sammy had seen a few people who did not belong to the backwoods. The strangers she had met were hunters or cattlemen, and all these had been, in dress and manner, not unlike the natives themselves. This man, who had so unexpectedly come out of the mist the night before, was unlike anyone the young woman had ever known. Like Jed Holland, she felt somehow as if he were a superior being. The Matthews family were different in many ways from those born and raised in the hills. And Sammy's father, too, was different. But this stranger, it was quite as though he belonged to another world. Coming to the big, low gap, the girl looked far away to the blue line of hills, miles and miles away. The stranger had come over from these, she thought. And then she fell into wondering what the world beyond the farthest cloud-like ridge was like. Of all the people Sammy had ever known, young Stuart was the only one who had seen even the edge of that world to tell her about it. Her father and her friends, the Matthews, never talked of the old days. She had known Ollie from a child. With young Matt, they had gone to and from the log schoolhouse along the same road. Once, before Mr. Stewart's death, the boy had gone with his father for a day's visit to the city, and ever after had been a hero to his backwoods schoolmates. It was this distinction, really, that first won Sammy's admiration and made them sweethearts before the girl's skirts had touched the tops of her shoes. Before the woman in her was fairly awake, she had promised to be his wife, and they were going away now to live in that enchanted land. Spying an extra choice bunch of grass a few steps to one side of the path, Brownie turned suddenly towards the valley, and the girl's eyes left the distant ridge for the little cabin in the sheep corral in Mutton Hollow. Sammy had always spoke of that cabin as young Matt's house, and, all uninvited now, the thought came, who would live with the big fellow down there in the valley when she had gone far away to make her home with Ollie and his people in the city? An impatient tug at the reins informed Brownie that his mistress was aware of his existence, and for a time the pony was obliged to pass many a luscious bunch of grass. But soon the reins fell slack again. The little horse moved slowly, and still more slowly until, by the relaxed figure of his rider, he knew it was safe again to browse on the grass along the path. So, wondering, dreaming, Sammy Lane rode down the trail that morning, the trail that nobody knows how old. And on the hill back of the Matthews house, a team was standing idle in the middle of the field. At the big rock on the mountainside, where the trail seems to pause a moment before starting down to the valley, the girl slipped on her saddle and, leaving Brownie to wander at will, climbed to her favorite seat. Half reclining in the warm sunshine, she watched the sheep feeding near, and laughed aloud as she saw the lambs with wagging tails greedily sucking at their mother's sides. Nearby in a blockhaw bush, a mother bird sat on her nest. A gray mare with a week-old colt following her on unsteady legs came over to the ridge, and not far away a mother sow with 10 squealing pigs came out of the timber. Keeping very still, the young woman watched until they disappeared around the mountain. Then, lifting her arms above her head, she stretched her lithe form out upon the warm rocky couch with the freedom and grace of a wild thing of the woods. Sammy Lane knew nothing of the laws and customs of the so-called best society. Her splendid young womanhood was not the product of those social traditions and rules that kill the instinct of her kind before it is fairly born. She was as free and physically perfect as any of the free creatures that lived in the hills, and keenly alive to the life that throbbed and surged about her. Her woman's heart and soul responded to the spirit of the season. The droning of the bees and the blossoms that grew in a cranny of the rock, the tinkle of the sheep bells as the flock moved slowly in their feeding, and the soft breathing of Mother Earth was in her ears, while the gentle breeze that stirred her hair came heavy with the smell of growing things. Lying so, she looked far up into the blue sky where a buzzard floated on lazy wings. If she were up there, she perhaps could see the world beyond the hills. Then suddenly a voice came to her, Aunt Molly's voice. "How do you reckon you'll like being a fine lady, Sammy, and living in the city with all the big folks?" The girl, turning on her side and raising one elbow, looked up again at Mutton Hollow, with its little cabin half hidden in the timber. And as she looked, slowly her rich red, life-colored cheek and neck and brow. With the hidden gesture of impatience, Sammy turned away to her own home on the southern slope of the mountain, just in time to see a young woman ride into the clearing and dismount before the cabin door. It was her friend, Mandy Ford. The girl on the rock whistled to her pony and, mounting, made her way down the hill. All that day, the strange guest at the Matthews place was the one topic of conversation between the two girls. "Shucks," said Mandy, when Sammy had finished a very minute description of Mr. Howitt. "He's just some revenue, like's not." Sammy tossed her head. "Revenue? You ought to see him. Revenues don't come in no such clothes as them. And they don't talk like him, neither." "Can't tell about no revenues," retorted the other. "Don't you mind how that foolin' everybody over there in the bend last year? He was just as common, and all the folks lowered he was just one of them. But this one ain't like anyone we had ever met up with, and that's just it," returned Sammy. Mandy shook her head. "You say he ain't huntin'. He sure ain't buying cattle this time o' year, and he ain't a wantin' locate a comin' in on foot. What else can he be but a revenue?" To which Sammy replied with an unanswerable argument. "Looky here, Mandy Ford, you just tell me, would a low-down revenue ask a blessin' like Parson Bigelow does?" At this, Mandy gave up the case, saying in despair, "Well, what is he a-doin' here, then? 'Tain't like he's comin' down into the woods for nothin'." "He told old Matt that he was sick and tired of it all," answered the other. "Did he look like he was an ailin'?" Sammy replied slowly, "I don't reckon it's that kind of sickness he meant, but when you look right close into his eyes, he does 'pear kind o' used up like." In connection with this discussion, it was easy to speak of Miss Lane's fairly prospects, for it was not the stranger from the city, and was not Sammy going to live in that land of wonders? The two girls were preparing for the night when Sammy, who was seated on the edge of the bed, paused, with one shoe off, to ask thoughtfully, "Mandy, what is love, anyhow?" Mandy looked surprised. "I reckon you ought to know," she said with a laugh. "Ollie's been a-hangin' around you ever since I can remember." Sammy was struggling with the knot in the other shoelace. "Yes," she admitted slowly. "I reckon I ought to know, but what do you say it is, Mandy?" "Why, it's just a caring for somebody more'n for ary one else in the whole world." "Is that all?" The knot was still stubborn. "No, it ain't all. It's going to live with somebody and letting him take care of you instead of your folks." Sammy was still struggling with the knot. "And it's a cooking and a scrubbing and a mending for him. And sometimes it's a splitting wood and doing chores too. And I reckon that's all." Here the knot came undone, and the shoe dropped to the floor with a thud. Sammy sat upright. "No, it ain't, Mandy. It's a heap more than that. It's nursing babies and taking care of 'em till they're full grown up. And then, when they're big enough to take care of themselves, you're old enough in the way. Look, Grandma Bowles, it's a looking back over it all, and being glad you done married the man you did. It's a heap more in living with a man, Mandy. It's a doing all that without ever once wishing he was somebody else. This was too much for Mandy. She blushed and giggled, then remarked as she gazed admirably at her friend. You'll look mighty fine, Sammy, when you get fixed up with all them pretties you'll have when you and Ollie get married. I wish my hair was bright and shiny like yourn. How do you reckon you'll like being a fine lady anyhow? Here it was again. Sammy turned upon her helpless friend with, How do I know if I would like it or not? What is being a fine lady anyhow? Why, being a fine lady is a living in a big house with carpets on the floor and looking glasses and not having no work to do and wearing pretty clothes with lots of rings and things and she paused and finished in triumph, and riding in a carriage. That wide, questioning look was in Sammy's eyes as she returned. It's a heap more'n that, Mandy. I don't jest sense what it is, but I know 'tain't all them things that make a sure enough lady. 'Tain't the clothes he wears that make Mr. Howitt different from the folks we know. He don't wear no rings. He walks. He's just different 'cause he's different, and would be no matter what he had on or where he was. This, too, was beyond Mandy, Sammy continued as she finished her preparations for retiring. This here house is pretty big for me, at least it would be if it had one more room, like the cabin in Mutton Hollow. Carpets would be mighty dirty and unhandy to clean when the menfolk come trampling in with their muddy boots. I wouldn't want to wear no dresses so fine I couldn't knock around in the bush with them, and it would be awful to have nothing to do. As for a carriage, I wouldn't swap Brownie out for a whole city of carriages. She slipped into bed and stretched out luxuriously. Do you reckon I could be a fine lady and be as I am now, a-livin' here in the hills? The next day, Mandy went back to her home on Jake Creek, and in the evening Sammy's father, with Wash Gibbs, returned, both men and horses showing the effects of a long, hard ride. Chapter 8. Why Ain't We Got No Folks? Preachin' Bill says, There is a heap of difference in most men, but Jim Lane now, he's more different than every man you ever seed. Ain't no better neighbor than Jim anywhere, right out of his way any time to do you a favor. But you bet there aren't every men lives can ask Jim any full questions while Jim's a-looking at him. Tried it once myself. Jim was a-waiting at the ferry for Wash Gibbs, and we was a-talking along right pert about crops and the weather and such, when I says hi like a dumb old fool, How'd you like it down in Texas, Jim, when you was there at that time? Hi, coonies. His jaw sheet with a click like he had cocked a pistol, and that look o' his'n, like he was a-seeing a plumb through you, come into his eyes, and he says he quite like, D, you reckon that rain over James yesterday raised the river much? And 'fore I knowed it, I was a-telling him how much that old red bull of mine tread the Perkins boys when they was a-possum hunting. Many stories of the bald knobber's days, when the law of the land was the law of the rifle and the rope, were drifting about the countryside, and always, when these tales were recited, the name of Jim Lane was whispered, while the bolder ones wondered beneath their breath where Jim went so much with that Wash Gibbs, whose daddy was killed by the government. Mr. Lane was a tall man, well set up, with something in his face and bearing that told of good breeding, southern blood, one would say, by the dark skin and the eyes, hair, and drooping mustache of black. His companion, Wash Gibbs, was a gigantic man, taller and heavier even than the elder Matthews, but more loosely put together than old Matt, with coarse, heavy features, and, as Grandma Bull said, the look of a sheep-killing dog. Grandma, being very near her journey's end, could tell the truth even about Wash Gibbs, but others spoke of the giant only in whispers, save when they spoke in admiration of his physical powers. As the two men swung stiffly from their saddles, Sammy came running to greet her father with a kiss of welcome. This little exhibition of affection between parent and child was one of many things that marked the Lanes different from the natives of that region. Your true backwoodsman carefully hides every sign of his love for either family or friends. Wash Gibbs stood looking on with an expression upon his brutal face that had very little of the human in it. Releasing his daughter, Mr. Lane said, "Got anything to eat, honey? We're powerful hungry. Wash load we'd better tie up at the river, but I knew you'd be watching for me. The horses are plumb beat." And Gibbs broke in with a coarse laugh. "I wouldn't mind killing a hoss either, if I wouldn't get what you would do at the end of the ride." To this, Jim made no reply, but began loosening the saddle's girths, while Sammy only said as she turned towards the house, "I'll have supper ready for you directly, Daddy." While the host was busy caring for his tired horse, the big man, who did not remove the saddle from his mount, followed the girl into the cabin. "Can't you even tell a feller howdy?" he exclaimed, as he entered the kitchen. "I did tell you howdy," replied the girl sharply, staring at the fire. "'Pears like you might have been a grain warmer about it," growled the other, seating himself where he could watch her. "If I'd been young Matt or that skinny old Ollie Stewart, you would have been keen enough." Sammy turned and faced him with angry eyes. "Look a-here, Wash Gibbs. I done told you last Thursday when you come for Daddy that you better leave me alone. I don't like you, and I don't aim to ever have anything to do with you. You done fixed yourself with me that time at the Cove picnic. I'll tell Daddy about that if you don't mind. I don't want to make no trouble, but you've just got to quit pestering me." The big fellow sneered. "I lowed you might change your mind about that someday. Jim ain't gonna say nothing to me, even if he did. Words don't break no bones. I'm a heap the best man in this neck of the woods, and your pa knows it. You know it too." Under his look, the blood rushed the girl's face in a burning blush. In spite of her anger, she dropped her eyes and, without attempting a reply, returned to her work. A moment later, Mr. Lane entered the room. A single glance at his daughter's face, a quick look at Wash Gibbs as the bully sat following with wolfish eyes every movement of the girl, and Jim stepped quietly in front of his guest. At the same moment, Sammy left the house for a bucket of water, and Wash turned towards his toast with a start to find the dark-faced man gazing at him with the look that few men could face with composure. Without a word, Jim's right hand crept steadily inside his hickory shirt, where a button was missing. For a moment, Gibbs tried to return the look. He failed. Something he read in the dark face before him, some meaning and light of those black eyes, made him tremble, and he felt, rather than saw, Jim's hand resting quietly now inside the hickory shirt near his left armpit. The big man's face went white beneath the tan. His eyes waved and shifted. He hung his head and shuffled his feet uneasy, like an overgrown schoolboy brought sharply the tasks by the master. Then Jim, his hand still inside his shirt, drawled, softly, but with a queer metallic ring in his voice, "Do you reckon it's gonna storm again?" At the commonplace question, the bully drew a long breath and looked around. "We might have a spell of weather," he muttered, "but I don't guess it'll be tonight." Then Sammy returned, and they had supper. Next to his daughter, Jim Lane loved his violin, with no good reason, for the instrument had once belonged to his great-grandfather, who, tradition says, was a musician of no mean ability. Preachin' Bill, lower there was a heap o' difference between playing a violin and just fiddlin'. You wouldn't know some fellers were making music if you didn't see 'em a-pattin' their foot, but you hit that ain't a way with Jim Lane. He sure do make music, real music. As no one ever questioned Bill's judgment, it is safe to conclude that Mr. Lane inherited something of his great-grandfather's ability, along with his treasured instrument. When supper was over and Wash Gibbs had gone on his way, Jim took the violin from its peg above the fireplace and, tucking it lovely under his chin, gave himself up to his favorite pastime, while Sammy moved busily about the cabin, putting things right for the night. When her evening tasks were finished, the girl came and stood before her father. At once the music ceased and the violin was laid carefully aside. Sammy seated herself on her father's knee. "La, child, but you're sure grown up," said Jim, with a mock groan at her weight. "Yes, Daddy, I reckon I'm about growed. I'll be 19 come Christmas." "Oh, shucks," ejaculated the man. "It wasn't more than last week that you was a-washing doll clothes down by the spring." The young woman laughed. "I didn't wash no doll clothes last week," she said. Then her voice changed, and that wide, questioning look, the look that made one think so of her father, came into her eyes. "There's something I want to ask you, Daddy, Jim. You know, Ollie's going away, and I was thinking about it all day yesterday, and Daddy, why ain't we got no folks?" Mr. Lane stirred uneasily. Sammy continued, "There's the Matthews. They've got kin back in Illinois. Mandy Ford's got uncles and aunts over in Lane's Creek. Jed Holland's got a granddad and ma, and even Preachin' Bill talks about a pack of kins over in Arkansas. Why ain't we got no folks, Daddy?" The man gazed, long and thoughtful, at the fresh young face of his child, and the black eyes looked into the brown eyes keenly, as he answered her question with another question. "Do you reckon you'll love him right smart, honey? Are you sure, dead sure, you ain't thinking of what he's got instead of what he is? I know it'll be mighty nice for you to be one of the fine folks, and there's big reasons why you ought. But it's gonna take a mighty good man to match you. A mighty good man. And it's the man you've got to live with, not his money." "Ollie's good, Daddy," she returned in a low voice, her eyes fixed upon the floor. I know, replied Jim. "He wouldn't do nobody no harm. He's good enough that way, and I ain't a faultin' him. But you ought to have a man, a sure enough good man." "But tell me, Daddy, why ain't we got no folks?" The faintest glimmer of a smile came into the dark face. "You're sure growed up, girl. You sure growed up, girl. You sure are. And I reckon you might as well know." Then he told her. Chapter 9. Sammy Lane's Folks. It began on a big southern plantation where there were several brothers and sisters, with a gentleman father of no little pride, and a lady mother of equal pride and great beauty. With much care for detail, Jim drew a picture of the big mansion with its wide lawns, flower gardens, and tree-bordered walks, with its wealth of culture, its servants, and distinguished guests. For he said, "When you get to be a fine lady, you ought to know that you got as good blood as the best of the thoroughbreds." And Sammy, interrupting his speech with a kiss, bade him to go on with his story. Then he told how the one black sheep of that proud southern flock had been cast from the beautiful home while it's still hardly grown, and how, with his horse, gun, and violin, the wanderer had come into the heart of the Ozark wilderness, when the print of moccasined feet was still warm on the old trail. Jim sketched broadly here, and for some reason did not fully explain the cause of his banishment. Neither did he comment in any way upon its justice or injustice. Time passed, and a strong, cleared eye, clean-limbed, deep-bosomed mountain lass, with all the mastering passion of her kind, mated the free, half-young hunter, and they settled in the cabin by the spring on the southern slopes of Dewey. Then the little one came, and in her veins there was mingled the blue blood of the proud Southerners and the warm red life of her wilderness mother. Again Jim's story grew rich in detail. Holding his daughters at arm's length and looking at her through half-closed eyes, he said, "You're like her, honey. You're mighty like her. Same eyes, same hair, same mouth, same build, same way of moving, strong but smooth and free-like. She could run clean to the top of Dewey or sit in a horse all day. Do you ever get tired, girl?" Sammy laughed and shook her head. "I've run from here to the signal tree lots of times, Daddy." "You're just like the old folks, too," mused Jim. "Like them in what you think and say." "Tell me more," said the girl. "Seems like I remember being there in a big wagon, and there was a woman there, too. Was she my mother?" Jim nodded and unconsciously lowered his voice as he said, "It was in the old Bod Knobber time. Things happened in them days, honey. Many the nights I've seen the top of O'Dewey yonder black with men. It was when things was a-broken up that your mother and me thought we could do better in Texas, so we went." Jim was again sketching broadly. "Your mother left us there, girl. Seemed like she couldn't stand it, being away from the hills or something, and she just gave up. I never did rightly know how it was. We buried her there, way out in the big plains." "I remember her a little," whispered Sammy. Jim continued. "Then, after a time, you and me came back to the old place. Your mother named you Samantha, but being as there was no boy, I always called you Sammy. It seemed right enough that way now, for you sure been more than a son to me since we've been alone, and that's one reason why I learned you to write and shoot with the best of them. There's them that says I ain't done right by you, bringing you up without our woman about the place. I don't know how I have, but somehow I couldn't never think of no woman as I ought, after living with your mother. And then there was Aunt Molly to learn you how to cook and do things about the house. I counted a good bit, too, on the old stock, and it sure showed up right. You're like the old folks, girl, in the way you think, but you're like your mother in the way you look." Sammy's arms went around her father's neck. "You're a good man, Daddy Jim, the best daddy a girl ever had, and if I ain't all bad, it's on account of you." There was a queer look on the man's dark face. He had sketched some parts of his tale with a broad hand indeed. The girl raised her head again. "But, Daddy, I wish you'd do something for me. I don't like Wash Gibbs to be coming to here. I wish you'd quit riding with him, Daddy. I'm afeard of him. He looks at me so. He's a sure bad one. I know he is, Daddy." Jim laughed, and again there was that odd metallic note in his voice. "I've knowed him for a long time, honey. Me and his daddy was together when he died, and you used to sit and wash his knee when you were a little tad. Now that he's so mighty much older than you, but he was a man's size at 15. You don't understand, girl, but I've got to go with him sometimes. But don't you fret. Wash Gibbs ain't gonna hurt me, and he won't come here more'n I can help either." Then he changed the subject abruptly. "Tell me what you've been doing while I was away." Sammy told her of her visit to her friends at the Matthews place, and of the stranger who had come into the neighborhood. As the girl talked, her father questioned her carefully, and several times a metallic tone crept into his soft, drawling speech, while into his eyes came that peculiar, searching look, as if he would draw from his daughter even more than she knew of the incident. Once he rose, and going to the door, stood looking out into the night. Sammy finished with her answer demanding Ford's opinion of the stranger. "You don't reckon a revenue would ask for a blessing, do you, Daddy? Seems like he just naturally wouldn't dast. God would have made the fiddles stick in his throat and choke him, sure." Jim laughed as he replied, "I don't know, girl. I never heard of a revenue doing such, but a feller can't tell." When Sammy left him to retire for the night, her father picked up the violin again and placed it beneath his chin as if to play. But he did not touch the strings, and soon hung the instrument in its place above the mantel. Then, going to the doorway, he lighted his pipe, and, for a full hour, sat looking up the old trail towards the Matthews place, his right hand thrust into the bosom of his hickory shirt, where the button was missing. Chapter 10. A Feat of Strength and a Challenge. What the club is to the city man, and the general store or post office to the citizens of the country village, the mill is to the native of the backwoods. Made to saw the little rough lumber he needs in his primitive building, or to grind his corn into the rough meal that is his staff of life, the mill does more for the settler than this. It brings together the scattered population. It is the news center, the heart of social life, and the hub of the industrial wheel. On grinding day, the Ozark mountaineer goes to the mill on horseback, his girths in a sack behind the saddle, or indeed taking place at the saddle itself. The rule is first come, first served. So, while waiting his turn or waiting for a neighbor who will ride in the same direction, the woodsman has time to contribute his share to the gossip of the countryside, or to take part in discussions that are more or less vital interest. When the talk runs slow, there are games. Pitching horseshoes, borrowed from the blacksmith shop. There is always a blacksmith shop nearby. Running or jumping contest, or wrestling or shooting matches. Fall Creek Mill, owned and operated by Mr. Matthew and his son, was located on Fall Creek in the deep, narrow valley, about a mile from their house. A little old threshing engine, one of the very first to take the place of horsepower, in itself in turn already pushed to the wall by improved competitors, rolled the saw or burr. This engine, which had been rescued by Mr. Matthews from the scrap pile of Springfield machine shop, was accepted as evidence beyond question of the superior intelligence and genius of the Matthews family. In fact, Fall Creek Mill gave the whole Mutton Hollow neighborhood such a tone of up-to-date enterprise that folks from the Bend or the mouth of the James looked upon the Mutton Hollow people with no little envy and awe, not to say even jealousy. The settlers came to the Matthews Mill from far up the creek, crossing and recrossing the little stream, from Iron Spring and from Gardner, beyond Sand Ridge, following faint, twisting, brittle paths through the forest, from the other side of Dewey Bald, along the old trail from the cove and from the post office at the Forks, down the wagon road, through the pinery, and from Wolf Ridge and the head of Indian Creek beyond, climbing the rough mountains. Even from the river bottoms they came, yellow and shaking with the goo, to swap tobacco and yarns, and to watch with never-failing interest the crazy old engine, as young Matt patted and coaxed and flattered her into doing his will. They began coming early that grinding day, 2 weeks after Mr. Howitt had been installed at the ranch. But the young engineer was ready with a good head of steam in the old patch boiler, and the smoke was rising from the rusty sack in a long, twisting line above the motionless treetops. It was a great day for young Matt, great because he knew that Sammy Lane would be coming to the mill. He would see her and talk with her, and perhaps if he were quick enough, he might even lift her from the brown pony. It was a great day, too, because Ollie Stewart would be saying goodbye, and before tomorrow would be in on his way out of the hills. Not that it mattered what Ollie went or not. It was settled that Sammy was going to marry young Stewart. That was what mattered. And young Matt had given her up. And as he told his father in the barn that day, it was all right. But still, it was a great day because Ollie would be saying goodbye. It was a great day in young Matt's life, too, because on that day he would issue his challenge to the acknowledged champion of the countryside, Wash Gibbs. But young Matt did not know this until afterwards, for it all came about in a very unexpected way. The company had been discussing the new arrival in the neighborhood and speculating as to the probable length of Mr. Howitt's stay at the ranch, and while young Matt was in the burr house of his father, they had gone over yet again the familiar incidents of the ghost story. How Bud Wilson seen her as close from here to shop yonder. how Joe Gardner's mule had gone plumb hog wild when he tried to ride past the old ruins near the ranch, and how Lem Wheeler, while out hunting that roan steer o' hissin', it had heard a moanin' and a wailin' under the bluff. Upon young Matt's returning to his engine, the conversation had skillfully changed to Ollie Stewart and his remarkable good fortune. From Ollie and his golden prospects, it was an easy way to Sammy Lane and her coming marriage. Buck Thompson was just concluding a glowing tribute to the girl's beauty of face and form when young Matt reached for an axe lying near the speaker. Said Buck, "Preachin' Bill lowered the other day, it don't make no difference how much money the old man left Ollie, he'd be a poor sort of man anyhow. And that there's a heap better man than him right here in the hills that Sammy could 'a' had for the askin'. How about that, Matt?" called a young fellow from the river. Big man's face flushed at the general laugh which followed, and he answered hotly as he swung his axe. "You better ask Wash Gibbs. I hear he says he's the best man in these woods. I reckon as how Wash can back his judgment there," said Joe. "Wash is sure a good man," remarked Buck, "but there's another not so mighty far away that pretty nigh hold him level." He looked significantly to where young Matt was making the big chips fly. "Huh," grunted Joe. "I'll tell you, gentlemen, that man there, Gibbs, is powerful. Yes, sure he is. Tell you what I'd see him do." Joe pulled a twist of tobacco from his hip pocket and settled down upon his heels, his back against the post. "Wash and me was going to the settlement last fall, and just this side of the camp house on the Wilderness Road, we struck a threshing crew truck stuck in the mud with their engine. Had a breakdown o' some kind, something the matter with the hind wheel. And just as Wash and me drove up, the boss of the outfit was a-tellin' them to cut a big hole for the pry to lift the H&X, so's they could block it up and fix the wheel. Wash, he looked at him a minute and says he, 'Hold on, boys, you don't need airy pole.' 'What do you know about an engine, you darn hillbilly?' says the old man kind o' short. 'I don't know nothing about an engine, you prairie hopper,' says Wash, 'but I know you don't need no pole to lift that thing.' 'How'd you lift it then?' says the other. 'Why, I just catch a holt and lift,' says Wash. Gang like burst themselves laughing. 'Why, you blame fool,' says the boss. 'Do you know what that engine'll weigh?' 'Don't care a cuss what she'll weigh,' says Wash. 'She ain't planted there, is she?' And with that he climbs down from the wagon, and dum burn me if he didn't take hold of that hind X and lift one whole side of that there engine clean off the ground. Them fellers just stood around and looked at him to beat the sir. 'Well,' says Wash, still a-keepin' his holt side a block under her, 'I'll mosey along.' That boss didn't say a word till he got a bottle from the box on that wagon and handed it to Wash, and then he says kind of scared like, 'Where in the hell are you from, mister?' 'Oh, I just a kid from over the Wark,' says Wash, handing the bottle to me. 'You ought to see some of the men in my neighborhood.' Then we went on. When the speaker had finished, there was quiet for a little, and then the young man from the river drawled, 'How much did you say that engine there weighed, Joe?' There was a general laugh at this, which the admirer of Gibbs took good-naturedly. 'Don't know what she weighed, but she was about the size o' that one there,' he answered. With one accord, everyone turned to inspect the mill engine. 'Pretty good lift, Joe.' 'Let you and me take a pull at her, bud,' remarked Lem Wheeler. The two men lifted and strained at the wheel. Then another joined them, and amid the laughter and good-natured raillery of the crowd, the three men tried in vain to lift one of the wheels, while Mr. Matthew, seeing some of the unusual movement, came into the shed and stood with his son, an amused witness of their efforts. 'Sure this engine ain't bigger into the other one, Joe?' asked one of the group. 'Don't believe she weighs a pound more,' replied the mountaineer with conviction. 'I tell you, gentlemen, that man Gibbs is a wonder, he sure is.' Old Matt and his son glanced quickly at each other, and the boy shook his head with a smile. This little byplay was lost on the men who were interested in the efforts of the different ones, in groups of 3 to move the wheel. When they had at last given up, the young man from the river drawled, "You're right sure Hid weren't after the boss to give you that bottle that Wash lifted her, are you, Joe? Or was it hid on the way home from the settlement?" When the laugh at his insinuation had died out, Buck said thoughtfully, "Tell you what, boys, I'd like to see young Matt try that there lift." Mr. Matthew, who was just staring back to the Burr house, paused in the doorway. All eyes were fixed upon his son. "Try her, Matt. Show us what you can do," called the men in chorus. But the young man shook his head and found something that needed his immediate attention. All that morning, at intervals, the mountaineers urged the big fellow to attempt the feat, but he always put them off with some evasive reply or was too busy to gratify them. But after dinner, while the men were pitching horseshoes in front of the blacksmith shop, Buck Thompson approached the young engineer alone. "Look here, Matt," he said, "why don't you try that lift? Darn me if I didn't believe you'd fetch her." The giant looked around. "I know I can, Buck. I lifted her yesterday while Dad fixed the blocking. I always do it that way." Buck looked at him in amazement. "Well, why in thunder don't you show the boys then?" he burst forth at last. "'Cause if I do, Wash Gibbs will hear of it sure, and I'll have to fight him to settle which is the best man." "Good Lord," ejaculated Buck with a groan. "If you're afraid o' Wash Gibbs, it's the first thing I ever knowed you to be scared of." Young Matt looked at his friend steadily in the eyes as he replied, "I ain't afraid of Wash Gibbs. I'm afraid of myself. Mr. Howitt says, no man needn't to be afraid of nobody but himself. I've been a-thinkin' lately, Buck, and I see some things I'd never see before. I figure it that if I fight Wash Gibbs or anybody else just to see which is the best man, I ain't no better'n he is. I reckon I'll have to whip him some day, all right, and I ain't a-carin' much how soon it comes, but I ain't gonna hurt nobody for nothin' just 'cause I can." Buck made no reply to this. Such sentiment was a little too much for his primitive notions. He went back to the men by the blacksmith shop. It was not long, however, until the players left their game to gather once more about the engine. Lem Wheeler approached the young Matt with a serious air. "Look-a-here," he said, "all we want is to see you try that lift." "I ain't got no time for foolin'," replied the young man. "Dad's just a-pushin' to get done before dark." "Shucks," retorted the other. "It won't take a minute to try. Just catch and hold and show us what you can do." "What are you all so keen about my lifting for, anyhow?" demanded the big fellow suspiciously. "I ain't never set up as a strong man of this country." "Well, you seen it this way. Buck done bet me his mule called agin mine that you could lift her. And we want to settle the bet," exclaimed Lem. Young Matthew shot a glance at the mountaineer, who grinned joyously. "Yep," said Buck, "that's how it is. I'm a-backing you. I don't want to hurt yourself for me, but I sure do need that colt, old limbs. It's a dead match for sure." The giant looked at his friend for a moment in silence, then burst into a laugh of appreciation at Buck's hint. "Seeing how you were backing me, Buck, I'll have to get you that mule if I can." He shut off steam and, as the engine came to a stop, stooped and, with an apparent ease, lifted the rear wheel a full 4 inches from the ground. Loud exclamations of admiration came from the little group of men in the shed. Lem turned with a long face. "Them colts will make a fine team, Buck," he said. "You bet. Come on, help me break 'em," replied Buck with another grin of delight. "Wait till Wash Gibbs hears about this, and he'll sure be a-breaking young Matt," put in another. "Better get your fighting clothes on, Matt. Wash will never rest easy until you've done showed him." These and similar remarks revealed the general view of the situation. While the men were discussing the matter, a thin, high-pitched voice from the edge of the crowd broke in. "That there's a good lift, all right, but it ain't nothing to what I seed when I was in the circus in the city." Who had started the engine again turned quickly. Ollie Stewart was sitting on a horse nearby, and at his side, on the brown pony, was Miss Sammy Lane. They had evidently ridden up just in time to witness the exhibition of the giant's strength. Chapter 11. Ollie Stewart's Goodbye. Beside the splendidly developed young woman, Ollie Stewart appeared but a weakling. His shoulders were too narrow as he stooped, his limbs were tiny, his black hair straight, and his eyes dull. As young Matt stepped forward, Ollie dismounted quickly, but the big fellow was the first to the brown pony's side. Sammy's eyes shone with admiration, and as the strong man felt their light, he was not sorry at all that he had won the mule colt for Buck. "No," she said, declining his offered assistance. She did not wish to get down. They were going to the post office and would call for the mule on their way home. Young Matt lifted the sack of corn from Brownie's bag and carried it to the shed. When he returned to the group, Ollie was saying in his thin voice, "In the circus I seen in the city was a feller that lifted a man, big as Jet here, clean above his head with one hand." Buck turned to his big friend. His long look was met by a grim smile that just touched the corners of the lad's mouth, and there was a gleam in the blue eyes that betrayed the spirit within. The lean mountaineer again turned to the company, while the boy glanced at Sammy. The girl was watching him and had caught the silent exchange between the two friends. "Shucks," said Buck. "Matt could do that easy. Try it, Matt. Try Jet there." "Try hit once," called the chorus. This time the big fellow needed no arguing. With Sammy looking on, he could not resist the opportunity of Ollie himself had presented. Without a word, but with a quick tightening of the lips, he stepped forward and caught Jed by the belt with his right hand, and then, before anyone could guess his purpose, he reached out with his other hand and grasped Ollie himself in the same manner. There was a short step forward and a quick upward swing, and the giant held a man in each hand at full arm's length above his head. Amid the shouts of the crowd, still holding the men, he walked deliberately to the blacksmith shop and back, and then lowering them easily to their feet, turned to his engine. Ollie and Sammy rode away together, up the green arched road, and the little company in the mill shed stood watching them. As the finely formed young woman and her inferior escort passed from sight, a tall mountaineer from the other side of Compton Ridge remarked, "I done heard Preachin' Bill say the other day that mighty nigh all the here gee-hawkin', balkin', and kickin' amongst the married folk comes 'cause the teams ain't matched up right. Bill, he lowed God Almighty fixed it somehow so the birds and the vermins don't make no mistake, but left it plumb easy for men and women to be darned fools of themselves." Everybody grinned in appreciation, and another spoke up. "According to that, I'll bet 4 bets if them two yonder ever do get in the double harness, there'll be pieces of the outfit strung from the parsons clean to the burying ground." When the laughter had subsided, Buck turned to seeing young Matt just stand outside the shed, ostensibly doing something with his belt that led to the burr, but in reality looking up the creek. "Law," ejaculated Buck under his breath, "what a team they'd make." "Who?" said Lim, who was standing nearby. "Them mule colts," returned Buck with a grin. "They sure will, Buck. There ain't 2 better in the country. They're a dead match. I'll come over and help you break 'em when they're big enough." And then he wondered why Buck swore with such evident delight. One by one the natives received their meal in singly, or in groups of 2 or 3, were swallowed up by the great forest. Already the little valley was in the shadow of the mountain, though the sun still shone brightly in the treetops higher up when Ollie and Sammy returned from the forks. Mr. Matthew had climbed the hill when the last grist was ground, leaving his son to cool down the engine and put things right about the mill. "Come on, Mac," said Ollie as the big fellow brought out the meal. "It's time you was going home." The young giant hung back, saying, "You folks better go on ahead. I'll get home all right." "Didn't think nothing would get you," laughed Ollie. "Come on, you might as well go along with us." The other muttered something about being in the way and started to back into the shed. "Hurry up," called Sammy. "We're waiting." After this, there was nothing else for the young man to do but join them, and the three were soon making their way up the steep mountain road together. For a time, they talked of commonplace things. Then young Matt opened the subject that was on all their hearts. "I reckon, Ollie, that this here is the last time you'll ever be a-climbing this old road." As he spoke, he was really thinking of the time to come when Sammy would climb the road for the last time. "Yes," returned Stuart. "I'll go tomorrow, for sure sunup." The other continued, "It'll sure be fine for you to live in the city and get your schooling and all that. Us folks here in the woods don't know nothing. We ain't got no chance to learn. You'll be forgetting us all mighty quick, I reckon, once you get to living with your rich kin." "'Deed I won't," returned Ollie warmly. "Sammy and me, we've been talking about that this evening, and we aim to always come back to Mutton Holler once a year, just like the other folks, don't we, Sammy?" Brown Pony, stepping on a loose stone, stumbled towards the man walking by his side. The big fellow put out his hand quickly to the little horse's neck. For an instant, the girl's hand rested on the giant's shoulder, and her face was close to his. Then Brownie recovered his footing, and young Matt drew further away. Ollie continued, "We'd aim for you to come to the city after a while. I'm going to get Uncle Dan to give you a shop in the city if you can get out to these hills and be somebody like Worms." The tone was unmistakably patronizing. The big mountaineer lifted his head proudly and turned towards the speaker. But before he could reply, Sammy broke in eagerly. "Law, but you would sure be fine, wouldn't it, Matt? I know you'd do something big if you only had the chance. I just know you would. You're so kind o' big every way," she laughed. "It's a plumb shame for you to be buried alive in these hills." There was nothing said after this, until coming to the top of the ridge they stopped. From here Ollie and Sammy would take the old trail to the girl's home. Then, with his eyes on the vast sweep of the forest-clad hills and valleys, over which the blue haze was fast changing to the purple in the rays of the sun, young Matt spoke. "I don't guess you better figure on that. Some folks are made to live in the city and some ain't. I reckon I was built to live in these hills. I don't somehow feel like I could get along without them. Besides, I'd always been knocking against something there." He laughed grimly and stretched out his huge arms. "I've got to have room. Then there's the folks yonder." He turned his face towards the log house, just showing through the trees. "You know how it is, me being the only one left and Dad getting old. No, I don't guess you need to count on me being more than I am." Then, suddenly, he wheeled about and looked from one face to the other. There was a faint hint of defiance in his voice as he finished. "I've got an idea, too, that the backwoods needs men the same as the cities. I don't see how there could ever be a city, even, if it wasn't for the men that cleared the brush. Someone's got to lick Wash Gibbs someday, or there just naturally won't be no decent living in the neighborhood ever." He held up his big hand to the man on the horse. "Goodbye, and good luck to you, Ollie." The horses turned down the old trail with their riders, passed from sight. That night, Sammy Lane said farewell to her lover, and with many promises for the future, Ollie rode away to his cabin home to leave the next morning for that world that lies so far away from the world of young Matt and his friends, the world that is so easy to get into after all, and so impossible to get out of forever.